All right, I'm going to go ahead and kick us off for our webinar this afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us. I would love for you to type in the chat and let us know, as some of you have already been sharing where geographically you're coming in from for the webinar. If you'd like to let us know if you are new to the University of Notre Dame and the non-degree programs or the executive programs that we offer, we would love for you to let us know that you're new and that this is your first experience, or if you already are enrolled in a program or are interested in something that we offer. That's always interesting for us to know as well. So if you're an alumni, if you're a past participant, or hope to be a future participant, thank you for typing that in the chat. My name is Vicki Maris, and I'm an assistant director in the Stair Center for Executive Education in the Mendoza College of Business at the University of Notre Dame. My clients, I'm already getting tongue-tied. Let me slow down. My colleagues on the call with us today, you're seeing Kalinda Hamilton, who is also a staff member and on the team with me at the Stair Center. And we work in the non-degree programming. So those are the certificate courses and custom programs that are offered through the Stair Center. Dr. Christopher Adkins is on the call with us, and he is our content expert in this topic of empathy and leading with empathy. Thank you, Chris, for being with us today.
Looking forward to it.
Kalinda and I will be kind of watching the chat, and if you have questions or comments, we'll be watching for those. So feel free to use the chat for that purpose. And we also, I want to invite you to a Zoom video chat that we'll do tomorrow at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. And that will be a deeper dive into this topic. So if you're interested in being a part of that call, and that's more of a typical Zoom call where most of us are on camera, Chris is going to be our facilitator and address your questions and comments. We will get to several of them today during the webinar, but that call tomorrow is to be able to dive deeper. So if you are interested in that, please send me an email and I will send you the link so you can join that Zoom chat tomorrow. My email address is vmaris@nd.edu, and either Kalinda or I will get that typed in the chat too to make it available. Also, if you'd like the slides from today, we can send a PDF of the slides, so happy to do that. So thank you for typing in the chat. I'm seeing all kinds of responses here. Kalinda, I'll name a couple of them, and if you see a few I've been missing, we won't be able to get to all of them, but I want to give several of you a shout out. So I'm so glad to we have someone from our development office at Notre Dame. Thank you so much for being here. I'm seeing Mike from Overland Park, Kansas, who is new to our Notre Dame programs. A past certificate alum from Goshen, Indiana. So Chris teaches in the Certificate in Executive Management, which is the program that is sponsoring this series of webinars, and several of our other faculty who teach in that program. It's a 4-module program. They have also been sharing their areas of expertise. We are just honored that they're willing to spend some time with us in this webinar format, and I share that it's been such a neat way for us to connect with those of you who are alums of our programs that all 3 of us have gotten to meet in past program experiences, but also to connect with those of you who are very interested in this topic or interested in our programming. I know we have guests who have joined the call, and we're so glad that you're here as well. You are seeing a list of our programs. These are the ones that are coming up for the fall semester. And I'm sure as many of you are dealing with, we've done some schedule changing and making some adjustments to the best of our ability to keep people safe as we go back to the classroom. So we'll have less people in the classroom at any given point, or for this fall anyway. These are some of the programs coming up. This particular webinar and this series is not of a promotional nature, so that's not the point of putting them together. We were wanting to get these topics to you and provide opportunity for this conversation. So that will be a part of the slide deck. If you are interested in each of those programs, do have web pages, and they're associated online enrollment forms available. I have been doing this for each of our webinars in this series. I open up our list of registered participants right before we get started and speak each one of your names out loud and have said a prayer over you and over the work that you are doing as leaders. And I want to thank you on behalf of Kalinda and Dr. Adkins and the team of staff and faculty that we work with in the Mendoza College of Business. We thank you for your commitment to being a leader and also to being a lifelong learner. That is what you're demonstrating by being here today, or if you are watching this on the replay, the same goes to you. We appreciate each and every one of you. I am honored to introduce you a little bit more officially to Dr. Christopher Adkins, who, as I mentioned, teaches and certificate in executive management. He teaches in our Executive MBA program. He teaches in several of our other both non-degree programs and degree programs. And we always enjoy every single moment that we get to be in the classroom with you, Chris. And I have literally seen that on evaluations that have come in after our programs that say, more time with Chris, more time with Chris. So
Thank you.
Thank you for saying yes. Chris is the Executive Director of the Rex and Alex Martin Notre Dame Deloitte Center for Ethical Leadership. He is an Associate Teaching Professor in the Mendoza College of Business in Management and Organization. We are happy to provide his bio in more detail, but I would love to let him get right to his content. So Chris, would you like to take it away from here?
Sure, thank you. Thank you, Vicki. Thank you, Kalinda. Thanks to all my colleagues at Notre Dame. And I was scanning the list of participants, and it's so fantastic to see former students from my previous university where I taught at the College of William & Mary, as well as former students from the University of Notre Dame. I have this incredible job at Notre Dame where I get to teach undergrads, MBAs, and executives, as well as work with folks in Exec Ed, and then also get to direct the Notre Dame Deloitte Center for Ethical Leadership. And being able to connect with so many, it's an honor to be a part of your journey. So for those of you that have had me in class before, thanks for coming back. You may see some similar ideas, but I really want to zoom in to this particular moment in 2020 and see how we can leverage some of the insights around empathy. So thanks for your time. I'm going to invite you throughout the conversation today to post questions, any questions you have, into the chat feature, and Vicki and Kalinda will manage those. And I will try to stop several times to both answer those questions, and then if there are additional questions that come in throughout, and then we'll have a little bit of time for questions at the end. So just briefly, this is my promo. I'll show it to you at the end. The work that I do at Notre Dame basically translates best practices from the research to the business community. So Deloitte gave a very generous gift to Notre Dame to found this Center for Ethical Leadership, to look at all this incredible research that happens in the academy, and then how do we make it meaningful, practical, positive for the business community. So you're seeing several selections that I pulled up for today. We talk about creating speak up cultures, about how you can be authentic at work, how you can boost ethical behavior in your people, and how do you give feedback, for example, that drives performance as well as ethical behavior. So we're always trying to connect high purpose with high performance. If you're at all interested in following our work, you can go to our website. And if you want to get a weekly email from us, like you don't get enough emails already, but just in case you'd like to have some content curated for you, you always get something each week from us, as well as the 4 or 5 articles that were must-reads for the week around values-driven leadership. So it's just text to the number 33777, text empathy to 33777. Wow. Okay, just to get us started today, I wanted to give you an overview of 3 ideas I'd like to share with you. First is we want to talk about something called the social brain, this incredible field of social cognitive neuroscience, the cognitive neuroscience of social interactions. And our social brain has been under incredible stress, obviously with the COVID pandemic, and then what we're seeing across our streams of protests and riots, and really wanting to lean in and support from a distance from our own communities. So what does the social brain look like under stress and challenge, and how do we react? And then ultimately, how can we develop some empathy? How do we deepen our empathy? And I'm going to talk about empathy as a core leadership skill. I got excited about empathy because I was teaching ethics for quite some time, continue to do so. but was excited that empathy actually can be an incredible skill, not just for ethics, but for a variety of different functions in an organization, such as innovation or being a better leader, better follower, better communicator. So we're going to share some of the science of empathy. And then I really want to share with you as you walk away today, some specific strategies that you might use in this particular time that will cultivate empathy in yourself, in your family, in your colleagues, in the workplace. So I'd like to begin with this quote because much of what we're going to talk about today is how we see the world. And I'm going to talk about seeing the outside world, but also seeing the inside world. Seeing the outside world is what we see all around us every day, but we have this inner talk, this inner vision, and I want to connect it to imagination. So to be greatly good, one must imagine intensely and comprehensively. The pains and pleasures of his species must become one's own. The great instrument of the moral good is the imagination. And you'll hear from me today about how empathy is a way of tapping and leveraging our imagination. But I want to focus on two key words, and they're the two words that I've bolded there. Imagining intensely is going to be how empathy helps you zoom in. Zoom in on the person in front of you, maybe zoom in on the person that's far away from you. But we have to be careful with empathy because empathy is dangerous. Often we empathize with our in-group, with those who are like us, with those who we obviously care about. That's fantastic. But we often miss to empathize with people. Or as I always share with companies, all of us know how to empathize. We just don't do it all the time and we don't do it with everyone. And so this is where we get to imagining comprehensively. So we need to zoom out and we want to talk about extending our empathy. Even as we're still isolated, how do we get better at extending our empathy? So let's talk about the social brain under stress and challenge. I love sharing this slide in my sessions with my students at Notre Dame. Many of you may recall seeing this particular slide of this primate holding an iPhone in the water, right? I'm not even sure that's an iPhone, it might be an iPhone. But holding the smartphone kind of in the water. And there's a variety of different ways you could think about why this particular image. Obviously, we all feel overwhelmed with all the information that comes at us every day, and often through those phones. We wake up to that phone as our alarm. We already have so many things that are stretching for our attention, trying to get us to focus. But if you notice, it's not just about being kind of drowning in all of this data and information, but it's how zoomed in we are. And the exciting thing about these devices is, what do we do when we get on these devices? We often want to connect with others. This is why apps like Facebook and Instagram, these are social apps. We want to connect through social media. And yet at the same time, we could be missing our surroundings. And one of the most important things I wanted to highlight today is, as much as the technology changes, right, we experience, right, all of this new information, all this new technology to a pretty old brain. Now, the strength of the human species is not that we're the strongest, but it's we're the most social. So the reason that we have such a highly developed prefrontal cortex is our ability to be able to communicate with each other. And of course, we've designed these phones to be able to enter into the worlds of our families. We've been doing it through Zoom, we've been doing it through FaceTime. But it stresses us, right? It adds to our level of stress. Now, I want to focus on the word attention, because if there's one concept that comes up again and again in all of my sessions, particularly with executives, is there are so many things demanding your attention. And of course, now we've been teaching from home, working from home, learning from home. The work-life integration, right, is no longer balanced. There's very little distance. So many things are demanding our attention. The word attention in Latin comes from the root word tendere, which means to stretch, and the at in front means toward. So when we think about attention, it's literally what do we stretch toward. And as soon as we walk out of a meeting, right, or out of a conference session, right, what's the first thing we grab for? We grab that phone. Now, it helps us obviously bring us into worlds we might not see otherwise. And we're going to talk about how technology can help us extend our empathy. But I'm going to come back to this idea of attention and stretch toward, because, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen for just a second so you can kind of see me for a minute. Did it work? Hold on. Fantastic.
Good.
We're good?
You're good.
Fantastic. So, and of course, sirens in the background, fantastic. So when we think about attention and we think about being socially isolated, we have been grabbing our phones and our devices to try to stay as connected as possible. And every time we stretch for something, we make a choice. We make a choice about what we're going to take in. So right now, each one of us is processing the world through 5 senses. And what happens when we process these 5 senses is they come in separately, but they get integrated in our brain, and then they get interpreted. And this, of course, helps paint a picture of what the world looks like to us. One of the most important ideas when it comes to empathy is that not everyone has that internal map has the same internal theory or map about how they make sense of the world. And that begins with attention. Each one of us is taking in different information all the time. And we make decisions about which apps we use, which news sources we take our information from, whose stories we pay attention to. And as a result, as much as we're kind of stretching out or trying to connect with folks, we are also limited. And so we want to begin with a sense of humility, knowing that we can't see everything, that we all have blind spots, we all have biases. The reason I got excited about empathy is it gives me a way to kind of work on those blind spots and biases. So I'm going to come back to that theme near the end. So I will share my screen again, go back into our slides here. So give me just a second here. So when we think about this word attention, what do we stretch toward? The human brain is wired to look for faces. So we have these things, they've been debated, called mirror neurons, but what it ultimately means is that we're wired to look for human faces and read the emotions on people's faces. And that's really about trying to guess from this glance at the person's face, on the outside of the person, what are they thinking about on the inside? What are they feeling on the inside? What are they wanting on the inside? So how do we take this strength of wanting to look for faces and make it more effective? Now we know that marketers spend a lot of time thinking about what will grab our attention. So we stretch towards their particular magazine. If you look at a magazine rack, this one's pretty dated, it's about 5 years old, but always human faces, right? That's the primary image that you see when they're trying to grab your attention. Now, when we think about what goes on right now, when we have been seeing so many distressing images, is it makes us anxious. And so this is this intense emotion of fear. So anxiety and fear are related. And what we want to talk about when it comes to empathy is actually how do we kind of create some safety so that we feel less fearful in this time of high stress. Now, what's been stressing us? Worry about when are we going to see family again? Job safety. A variety of different concerns that we continue to have that activates what we call the low road in the brain and activates something called the amygdala, which is in the center of the screen here. That's the red area. And then, of course, how do we develop the high road activities to be able to kind of cool down and make sense of this the stress and anxiety that we're having? And empathy is pretty exciting because empathy is actually woven through the brain, as we're going to talk about in just a bit. When we do get anxious, one of the strengths of our species is what we call tending and befriending. And so when we feel the sense of threat, we often look for safety and support from others. So how do we tap into this evolutionary strength? Well, empathy gives us a way to get there. And I want to share with you something today called the social brain, and share with you a short video about the social brain. I'm going to try to broadcast the video. I hope it works today.
Humans are social beings that thrive when working in groups. Throughout history, we have enhanced our chances of survival by collectively sharing things such as resources, knowledge, and workloads. Alternatively, isolation or rejection from a group could have decreased our survival chances. As a result, our brain is highly aware of our ongoing social status and possible threats or rewards to this. Today, the workplace is one of the biggest social environments the brain experiences. Our brain is constantly providing us with feedback on our social interactions with others. We need to know when things are working in our favor, or when our social situation may be under threat. Our brain interprets our social interactions through the use of neural pathways and chemical messages commonly used for pleasure and pain. For example, when our brain recognizes potential rewards from a social interaction, it releases chemicals along the same neural pathways associated with pleasure, making us feel physically good. When we feel threatened, rejected, or taken advantage of, the same pathways that tell us we are in physical pain are activated. Our brains don't always operate in isolation to one another. We often trigger a threat or reward response to the people around us. We may not even realize we are doing this. So the next time you interact with someone at work, consider what social messages you may be sending and the impact you may be having on their brain.
So this idea of a social brain is pretty powerful. It comes out of the work of Matthew Lieberman and other researchers who've been doing work for quite some time in this field called social cognitive neuroscience. And I want to highlight a couple of key ideas. When you think about the social brain, think about it in terms of the signals that we send and receive all the time. And so we're always sending signals to the people around us, and we're also receiving signals. And of course, if you're in a leadership role, you know that you always have to be very mindful of the signals that you're sending your team. Obviously, any parent knows you have to be very mindful of the signals you're sending your children. And we think about this idea of signals because if you heard this quote from the, if you zoomed in on this quote from the video, our brains do not act in isolation from each other. So the signals I send shape the reactions of the people around me, and vice versa. Those signals I receive influence me. And this may seem like a very simple or obvious idea, but I want to highlight it because when we think about empathy, we often misread the signals that we're receiving from other people. And so empathy is not just about trying to understand someone else's point of view or how they're feeling, but how do I get more accurate in doing so? And one of the reasons I think my wife is probably happy that I study empathy, there's not a day that goes by that I don't misunderstand the way where she's coming from. And so, and I misread those signals. There's another part of this too, which is how do I get better at sending signals and making sure that I can influence those around me. Now, why is this so powerful, this idea of the social brain? Because when we think about something like empathy or leadership or collaboration or teamwork, this is a skill that we acquire through something called social learning. And I don't mean social media. I mean, we learn through observing others and modeling their behavior. So the people around us kind of can shape how we learn what behaviors are appropriate or not. So it seems very obvious. We obviously think about this quite a bit when we're raising our families. Well, the reason that I wanted to begin with that idea of the social brain and then and connect to empathy is because of this idea called the Mental Trilogy. So this comes from the work of Joseph Ledoux, a book in 2003 called The Synaptic Self. But when we think about the processes inside the human brain, we can think about it as cognition, emotion, motivation, or more simply, thinking, feeling, and wanting. Now, this may seem like an abstract concept to you, but I find this incredibly valuable. So whenever I design a session or design a meeting, or even think about a conversation or an interview, I'm always thinking about, what do I want this person to think? What do I want this person to feel? What do I want this person to want or do? But empathy is about beginning with, what are they currently thinking? What are they currently feeling? And what are they currently wanting? So this is quite important because we begin with our own mental trilogy of how we're processing, but how do we understand that others are not paying attention to the same things and they're not processing the same way? And one of the things that's discouraging sometimes about education is most of our education is focused in the cognition thinking category and not really on reading people's emotions. And then this new area that I'm quite focused on right now, which is how do we understand someone else's desires, right? How do we get inside what someone else truly wants? And I know I have 3 boys. To motivate each of them, I have to try some different strategies. And if you've managed a team, you know that what drives people, yes, very much the same, but also a little bit different for each person. So how do we get better at what I'm going to call motivational empathy, understanding the motivations of someone else? So the good news about empathy is that from a jobs perspective and for the future is as we move into a world with more and more machines, and we'll be co-botting before we know it, and we will be engaged in this collaboration, so to speak, with artificial intelligence. We need empathy and storytelling and collaborating more so than we've ever had before, because many of the computational jobs, obviously it's easier to give those to the machines. So highlight this from the work of Jeff Colvin on Humans Are Underrated, Empathy Above All. And then of course, how do we put together the STEM jobs with empathy? This is what Thomas Friedman has called the STEmpathy jobs of the future will be those who kind of have high empathy, right? But also the high technical skills as well. Now, empathy has been pretty top of mind for people who are doing design thinking. So design thinking has been a hot idea over the last decade, and empathy is the first step. right? So the whole idea is if before you define the problem, you need to empathize with who has the problem. And this is called empathic design, which means thinking from the perspective of your users and doing everything you can to feel and understand what they are experiencing. Now, I'm going to give you a more precise definition of empathy in just a minute, but most people confuse empathy with sympathy or compassion. And I'm make that distinction in just a minute, but for now, the word I want you to hold on to is understand. So think about empathy as being able to deeply understand someone's thoughts, feelings, and desires. And that is often about standing under their experience. So just take that word understand, break it into flip them. How do I stand under someone else's experience? And sometimes we can't. It's very difficult to do so. We'll look at some of those challenges. When Warby Parker, so this is the eyeglass company, they were selected as the most innovative company back in 2015 for their significant disruption of the eyeglass industry. Their strategy in terms of disrupting that industry, in addition to fantastic design and operations, was how do they redesign the eyeglass buying experience? And that was through deep empathy with their customers. So just one example of kind of a startup who's used empathy as a key lever for their strategy and success. And then of course, Satya Nadella at Microsoft has been using empathy as a key driver as they change the culture and of course foster innovation inside Microsoft. So with that, we've kind of set up our conversation to take a deeper dive into the science of empathy, but I wanted to lay that foundation around social brain under stress, how we're having a difficult time standing under the experiences of another. When we integrate empathy into our work, it can be quite transformative for innovation and culture. We're going to bring it into a couple of other ideas as well. Let me pause there and see if there's any questions that have come in or if there's any questions that folks would like to ask at this point before I transition to the science of empathy as a core leadership skill. Vicki or Kalinda, do we have any questions to address at this point?
We do here. I'm just reading a new one from Cynthia. I'll go ahead and read it. It's fresh for me too. Okay, Chris.
Okay.
Having managed contact centers for many years, I was really aware of the power of body language and facial expression. When you only have the voice, you have to be aware. The same thing happens with text, only worse. We don't even have the voice. We apply our perceived tone and meaning based solely on how we see the letters / words in the message. And then parentheses, masks that are currently worn limit facial expression too. It makes it more challenging to really hear the person. That's from Cynthia.
That's an excellent observation. It's been so challenging for me to transition from teaching live and being able to see both the verbal and nonverbal, or hear the verbal and see the nonverbal information that my students would give me in the classroom. Now I just see everybody in these little rectangles. It's even been like socially depressing for me to, even when I go to the grocery store and everybody's face is hidden by the mask. You know, I'm someone who likes to engage with the cashier and connect with folks, and we're limited. So we're kind of hungry for this. And this is actually, when we think about this, is another stress level for us. So we have to, in some sense, try to create other ways of connecting and getting some different information. The number one strategy that I used with my classes as we moved to online with both my undergrads and executives is we did a lot of storytelling. Usually at the beginning of each class, I would often start with a question like, you know, share a story in small groups, like in your breakouts, of something that's lifting you up, and then something where you need support or prayers, something that's got you, that's weighing you down. And that brief ability for people, or that brief moment where people had the opportunity to just share socially, even if it was just via Zoom or even just audio, it's very, very valuable, but you have to work a little bit harder since we have limited kind of nonverbals today. Is there another question or two that came in that we should take, or?
Yeah, we have one from Kevin. He's asking if you would speak to empathetic leadership in this virtual COVID environment.
Sure. I will talk about that throughout the rest of it, but I will tell you, I wrote a piece that I never actually published about how leading in this moment of COVID and social isolation begins with empathy, because as I was listening, particularly to my Executive MBA students, you really got a sense of the diversity of what the experience was like as they were, say, working from a home office. Obviously, there was diversity based on, you know, the different industries people were working in. But I was also noticing that sometimes in the questions and the feedback in the class, the conversation, that people may not have been as sensitive to how different it was. Some folks were excited that they could have more time to maybe watch Netflix and do other things. And other folks like, I have no time at all between trying to homeschool my kids and working full time. And so I think one of the most important things is, as an empathic leader, to pass the mic very quickly and early in any meeting, just to check in. I've heard this has been happening in many organizations based on folks who have reached out to me and hearing this from a number of my students, but there's more time almost being built in for some of that quick check-ins. Another piece too, we'll talk about this at the end, which is how do you at least identify what your tendencies are and then maybe bracket those or put those aside so that you're not assuming everybody's experiencing this moment in the same way. But maybe there's some more specific questions there around empathic leadership that we can get to. Should we take another question, or should I go back into the?
Oh, why don't you go ahead and return to the slides, and I'll make note of some of the questions that are here, and we can either return to these, or again, I want to remind people, if you want to join us tomorrow at 4, we can dive into questions even further.
Fantastic. And I do hope, if you can join tomorrow at 4, I'd love to take some very focused questions. One of the difficult things when I'm trying to empathize with everyone on this call is that you're all coming with different experiences from different workplaces, different geographies. So I am trying to present at a very high level some of the science that we have around the social brain about empathy, and we'll share some strategies that hopefully will work for all of you. But I'd love to take some very particular nuanced questions. So please send them today, and if you can join us tomorrow, that's fantastic. So what I'm going to do at this point is go back into our slides for the second and probably the core kind of science theme that we want to talk about today. And this idea is empathy as a core skill of leadership. So I didn't share much about my background in the beginning of the call, but I'm originally trained as a philosopher. So if you go back to that Mental Trilogy, I was definitely focused on thinking, improving my own thinking, and then trying to teach ethics and teach philosophy. I was heavily focused on how do we improve people's thinking. But I just realized there was so much more. You had to become an excellent thinker, but it was incomplete. And often that, you could have these incredibly strong and logical arguments, and they weren't persuasive. There was something missing. And one of my first jobs out of undergrad was I taught elementary school, and I knew that connecting with these children emotionally and then really trying to connect and tune into like what I would call shared value or shared motivation was the key to really kind of collaborating and, of course, moving them or leading them in the direction to kind of grow them. And so empathy was exciting for me as I stopped pursuing philosophy with both my undergraduate and my master's work, as I wanted to look at how does the brain leverage not just our cognitive ability, but our emotional and motivational ability. And empathy is the only real construct, so to speak, that helps us kind of connect thinking, feeling, and wanting. I also got pretty excited because it's a core muscle. So I'm thinking about it as like your abs. So if you're going to the gym and if you have strong abs, you can do all these other exercises, all these other moves much more easily. Like you can maybe still do some of those moves, but if your abs are weak, it's going to be much more difficult. Empathy is the same way to me. So when I work with companies, I always tell them if they're going to invest in one skill, it won't get you everything, but it will get you many things. It would be empathy. Because empathy is one of the core skills for building trust. Everybody wants a high trust workplace. Trust is an outcome. How do you get there? When people feel that others really try hard to understand and appreciate their point of view. And obviously the ability to understand and appreciate other people's points of view helps with communication. I've been talking to organizations that have been using empathy to understand and solve problems. Doctors are being taught how to be more empathic because when they slow down and keep that pad in their pocket and really try to empathically listen, they get more data from the patient. And as they listen more intensely, and they take in those verbals and nonverbals, they get two good benefits come out of it. One of it, their accuracy goes up in terms of diagnosis and treatment. And of course, the patient feels heard and listened to, and then of course, wants to continue coming back to that particular doctor. I've highlighted how empathy is at the beginning of innovation and design. I spend quite a bit of my time these days doing workshops on diversity and inclusion, and we look at empathy as a core skill. Again, when we think about exclusion, it's the people we exclude are the people we don't empathize with. Empathy can be, but not always, a precursor to ethical behavior. But it can be pretty powerful there. And of course, I've talked about empathy and being able to motivate others. And then for change leadership, one of the number one reasons that change initiatives fail is because they haven't empathized with those who they're trying to lead or manage through the change. So I just see it as a core muscle, but and I've tried to highlight some companies that have used it well. But I wanted to at least start with that. So you have this idea of, okay, if I work on my empathy, I'm working on this core muscle. So what is empathy? How does it work? And how do we cultivate empathy in ourselves and others? So most folks think about empathy as, can I walk in another's shoes? That would be our folk definition. And then of course, many folks have read the book To Kill a Mockingbird. This is a quote that comes out of that. You never really understand a person until you consider things from his point of view, until you climb into his skin and walk around into it. So until you climb into another's skin and walk around in their skin. It sounds easy to understand. It is very, very difficult. And I always tell my students that I have a pet peeve that I don't want anyone to ever say to me. And that is, I understand exactly how you feel. I know exactly how you feel. Because I don't think any of us do. I don't think any of us understands exactly what it's like to be another. And you'd be surprised that that's my pet peeve because I focus on empathy. I think we should try. But I think we should always do so with an incredible sense of humility, knowing that we will never fully know what another person's experiencing. And of course, all of us have been in conversations where that person is listening to us, and as soon as we're done sharing our story, they say, that happened to me once, and I know exactly what that was like, and they take over, and all of a sudden, you feel like your story wasn't heard because they've already brought it to their particular story. So this idea of seeing things from another's point of view, walking into someone else's skin, challenging, right? I'd like to share with you a story from one of my experiences trying to be empathic. The image that you're seeing right now is a very inspiring group of people I got to spend a couple of weeks with. This was when I was teaching at the College of William & Mary. It was a summer program. And it was called the Young African Leaders Initiative, called YALI. The Obama administration set up this program to bring emerging leaders and community leaders and entrepreneurs to the United States and to do 6 to 7 weeks of training at different universities. And when I was, Notre Dame has a program like this and takes on YALI scholars, YALI leaders each year. And when I was working with these particular group of YALI scholars and emerging leaders, I was supposed to spend a day with them on empathy. And one of the things that I try to think about, particularly if I'm working with an international audience, is that this word empathy may not have the right translation in another language. So I started to try to do some research around, okay, what does empathy look like in maybe some of the different African languages, or what, even better than language, what might be some of the concepts that would be similar? And I couldn't find a word that was a great translation for empathy, but I found something better. Many of you have heard about this idea called Ubuntu. So Africans have a thing called Ubuntu. We believe that a person is a person through other persons, that my humanity is caught up, bound up inextricably with yours. When I dehumanize you, I dehumanize myself. The solitary human being is a contradiction in terms. Therefore, you seek to work for the common good because your humanity comes into its own in community and belonging. Those are the words of Desmond Tutu. I can't think of a more important concept right now for a polarized world, for a world that's deeply hurting. Whether you live in the United States and you've been observing all that we've been seeing, but this is really about deeply, or I should pause there and say, or you've been observing all the different, challenges and beyond challenges, the tragedies we've been seeing with so many lost lives with the pandemic. And it's overwhelming. And part of the reason it's overwhelming is that we are deeply connected as human beings. And this idea that when we dehumanize someone else, we actually hurt ourselves, really, really powerful. Empathy is a Western word. It comes out of the aesthetic literature. It shows up in the late 1900s. And it's about this idea of being able to project or throw yourself into another person. This concept of Ubuntu, I feel, is even more powerful because it recognizes as a core assumption that there is no such thing as a solitary human being and that we have to lift each other up or we'll be pulling each other down. So when we think about back to a more, oh, by the way, before I move forward from this, the reason I shared that story with you about the Yali community that I was able to kind of spend some time with is that I shared this idea of Ubuntu and said, I don't know if I was like, I've never been to Africa. I don't know much about African culture, but I did find this and it seemed to connect to what I want to talk to you today about with empathy. And there were a number of the leaders in the room who started to tear up. And I said, did I do something wrong or did I do something offensive? And they said, no, but they said, you're the first professor in our 6 weeks here who's actually tried to connect all that they're saying to our culture. Can you imagine sitting in classes for 6 weeks and all of this kind of Western thinking just without a recognition of what are the concepts or the ideas or the values of another? And it was really powerful for me that I always need to try to do that. It was really fantastic to be able to have that connection with them, and I still keep in touch with a number of them. So here's my pocket definition for empathy. I would not use this in a research paper because we need to be a little bit more precise, but as something, as a pocket definition, I define empathy as seeing and feeling as another. I want to unpack this very quickly, but hopefully very clearly to make some distinctions between sympathy and compassion. So I talked about empathy earlier as being activated by these mirror neurons or what we see, right? Of course, empathy can be activated through sound as well, but let's focus on seeing, partly because we want to connect to this idea of imagining, right? Also, I always observe that when people are in a debate or a disagreement, and then when they finally understood what the other person was saying, so this is the idea about empathy is understanding, they always say, I see what you mean. And it was almost as if they could take on that person's point of view. Obviously, empathy is about feeling. It's in that pathos family with sympathy and compassion. And it's obviously about other people, right? It's not about ourselves. There's no such thing as self-empathy, right? It's about others. So sympathy and compassion. You've heard me talk about these three terms. They have a family resemblance all around pathos or feeling. But the most important word to distinguish empathy from sympathy and compassion is the word as. And as is the preposition. I had a great philosophy professor who once told me that always pay attention to the prepositions because the prepositions define the relationship. And so let's think about this little word as. If empathy is seeing and feeling as another, sympathy is feeling for another, and compassion is feeling with another. Now those may sound like minor distinctions. They're incredibly powerful. For example, if you have a loved one who's sick in the hospital, you might send a sympathy card. And what that means is you feel for them, right? So sympathy is feeling for, but it doesn't mean you really understand what they're going through in that time. Now, compassion, stronger than sympathy and absolutely necessary. So it's not enough to send the sympathy card or even try to understand through empathy. It is about being with them. And so when we think about compassion, compassion is feeling with another. So this is similar to being a companion, going together. And sometimes compassion is the only thing we can do because we can't really empathize. We can't see and feel as another. You know, my mom went through a year of chemotherapy for breast cancer. And I don't know what that's like. And I couldn't. You know, I did a typical professor thing. I tried to read up on it. I tried to do the best I could, but it was incomplete. I didn't know how she felt. But the best thing I could do was try to be with her as much as I could during those treatments and you know, get on the phone and just kind of be that compassion side. So many folks say that that simple distinction is one of the key takeaways when we do a session on empathy. So I hope that's helpful for you. Again, this is this idea that we're wired to see each other. I got excited about empathy because it comes naturally to us. Here's the danger. We can turn it off. We look away. We don't want to look at certain people. Now, the research on empathy says we highlight two questions. I'm going to go through these pretty quickly. One is the question of empathic motivation. So what helps us respond with sensitivity and care to another person? This is where empathy moves from understanding or seeing another, trying to understand, and then responding with compassion. And then, of course, understanding what someone else is thinking and feeling. These are the two key things that empathy we think about. understanding another, and caring for another. And as I highlighted to you this mental trilogy before, there's three types of empathy. There's cognitive empathy, affective empathy, and motivational empathy. So understanding someone's thoughts, understanding someone's feelings, and understanding someone's desires. What's fascinating about this is that often we are stronger in one and not necessarily in another. So for example, my training as a philosopher, I was better at understanding someone's thoughts and needed to work on understanding and reading other people's feelings. And so there are different techniques you would use if you wanted to get better at understanding someone's thoughts, or understanding someone's feelings, or understanding someone's desires. And one of the key things that triggers empathy is the person right in front of us, and they're in our family or in group, and does it connect with our past experiences? As we're going to see in a minute, when I say immediate and involuntary triggers, these are good things because they're activated easily, and yet they can lead to biases. So how does empathy work? I'm going to give you a couple quick examples. This is a program called the Roots of Empathy program, and created by Mary Gordon, a Canadian entrepreneur, social entrepreneur. And what you see here is school children playing with a baby. And in this particular program, a married couple comes in with their child about once a month and plays with the children on the blanket and kind of interacts in front of the children. And they have a Roots of Empathy teacher who you can kind of see there in the background. And they're asking two questions again and again. What is little Jimmy feeling? Why is Jimmy feeling that way? So I want to go over that again. What is Jimmy feeling? Why is Jimmy feeling this way? And the children have to, in some sense, try to enter into or understand this child. And they do this once a month throughout the school year. You say, well, why do they do this? Well, not only does the emotional intelligence of these children go up, but bullying significantly drops in schools who do the Roots of Empathy program, right? And part of what's going on here is what we call role taking. We often think about empathy as how would I feel, or if I were in Isaac's situation. But we can think about other focused role taking. And this is the stronger one. How does Isaac feel? Often we throw ourselves into someone else's situation, but we're still bringing our own assumptions and our own backgrounds. How do we just get better at trying to understand how someone else feels? I'm going to go ahead and skip Lego Luke for a minute there. And I do want to highlight this idea of those two questions. What is that person feeling? Why are they feeling that way? This is how empathy is a zoom lens. And so the green regions that you see here are what's called the mirroring system. This lets us understand the emotions of another, or what is Isaac feeling? What is Jimmy feeling? And this lets us zoom in. But of course, and the exciting thing from a neuroscience perspective is you've got these other regions that move from understanding the emotions to understanding the thoughts. It's called the Mentalizing Network. This helps us zoom out. And if you look at these brain images, even if you don't know the different functions of the brain, what's pretty exciting is you can see, for example, how some of the regions are right next to each other. So the medial prefrontal cortex is next to the anterior cingulate cortex. And they can move back and forth from understanding emotions to understanding thoughts, from mirroring to mentalizing. You knew you were going to get some, at least one brain image in the conversation today. Here's the danger with empathy. And Paul Bloom has been talking about this, a researcher at Yale, that empathy is potentially biased. It can be like a spotlight and only focuses on some people. So in essence, it narrows our attention. So you heard those three triggers. We empathize with those right in front of us. So we're biased towards those right in front of us, those we can see. We tend to empathize with only those in our in-group. And of course, we tend to empathize easily with those who've had similar past experiences. Well, what if we don't have those same past experiences? And so I set this up because we want to be able to extend our empathy from those right in front of us, those that are in group, and those who have had similar past experiences, so that we're not just narrowing or stretching toward those who are easy to empathize with, but pushing ourselves beyond our blind spots. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and see if there's any questions. And then I've got 4 secrets to share with you before we wrap up. And of course, you'll be able to go through these slides after the event if you would like. So I'm sure there's some question that, of course, we'll have time tomorrow at 4 o'clock.
We do have several. I've made a few notes, and if I've missed your question, I definitely invite you to join us tomorrow at 4, where we have the Zoom video call. So one of these, Chris, was listed anonymously. This one is, what are your tips for dealing with a leader who is not empathetic?
Use those 2 questions. So the two questions I shared with you, which is, what is this person feeling? Why are they feeling this way? You can build these questions in around different stakeholders that so often we narrow in on the people that agree with us or the people that we find it easy to empathize with. So now it's about extending empathy through the questions we ask about who have we forgotten to consider in this particular design. And those would be some, I mean, I'll go into this in more detail tomorrow, where we can really think about this kind of, how do we activate empathy in others? If it's about interpersonal issues, that might be different than if it's about strategic issues, some of the, but also I will tell you that probably the number one thing, if you want someone else to be empathetic, is get good at empathizing with them, right? So really getting good at trying to understand their perspective.
All right, thank you. Bill asked if you can recommend favorite resources on this topic in leadership and empathy.
Sure, we could send some out afterwards. I'll name three right now. So one of my favorite researchers in the empathy space, because again, I'm not a neuroscientist, I look through that work, but I come at it from more of the social psychology lens, and often am in the practice of sharing other folks' research and applying it. Jamil Zaki's book, The War for Kindness. He's an incredible empathy researcher from Stanford. The book came out in the last year. It's a fantastic one. And the other one I'll mention right now, and maybe I'll think about one other. I mean, Matthew Lieberman, who the work, you saw that Social Brain video, he has a book called Social. That's fantastic. It's a little dense if you are not wanting to get into all of the neuroscience, but it's still got great examples. It's a great read. And a really challenging book, and I think a really important book, almost ahead of this moment that we're in when we're thinking about all of the issues around George Floyd's death and how we want to be supportive wherever we're starting, is The Person You Mean to Be by an incredible researcher named Dolly Chugg. And it is an incredible book about talking about our blind spots that we all have, and how do we start moving beyond them in a way that we are actually supporting others and doing so humbly.
All right, thank you.
Sure.
We have a question here of one of our participants in certificate who is mentioning that she manages a very diverse team, has a hard time getting some people on the team to open up. I'm a very empathetic person and full of compassion and sympathy, but I'm still finding it hard to connect with this one person on my team, but I don't want to stop trying to reach this individual. I don't want to make them uncomfortable if they don't want to share how they are feeling. So I'm guessing she's asking for some input there.
I'll be very quick because I'm going to move to these final slides, these 4 secrets, and you'll probably see some connections there. But one thing I think that's dangerous is if we put the spotlight too much on one person. So it's almost like the person feels that they're, again, in the spotlight. And so I often find that it's really important to kind of create conversations, or even what I might call exercises that I would do with a group of people so that everyone has a chance to share. The simplest one that I use quite a bit is called the values artifact exercise. It's something that I first experienced a version of it at Harvard Business School. And this is one where you invite everyone to kind of bring an object to a meeting or, to a conversation. And the object is something that symbolizes their values. I define values really simply: who matters most and what matters most. So something that symbolizes who or what matters most to you, and then tell the story. Now, by the way, this is show and tell from, preschool days, but people often, bring this prop, so to speak, and tell these incredible stories. And you now get to hear a part of them that you never would have heard otherwise. And people often share that it's just easier to do it with an object than it is to just, be telling their own story. So that's a quick exercise. Happy to share more of those tomorrow. If I could, just for time's sake, I'm going to go through 4 quick secrets around extending your empathy. Again, I think all of us have strengths when it comes to empathy, but we have blind spots. So how do we start to work on them? So I call these everyday empathy strategies for understanding and supporting each other. And I'm going to do them in about a minute apiece so that you'll get a chance to have one more round for some questions. And then any one of these you want to dive into more detail tomorrow at 4, happy to, or you can follow up with me individually. So this is a busy slide, but I'm gonna walk you through it. I think the number one thing that each of us needs to do is to begin with an intention inventory. What are the bright spots of what I pay attention to, or what are my blind spots? Who has your attention, and what are you taking in every day? So remember, attention is what we stretch toward. Who and what do you stretch toward? Right? And who do you rarely stretch toward? You can think about that, or the people you work with on a team. Who do you always ask for feedback on a project? Who's your go-to person? That's your bright spot. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but who do you rarely go to and why? Who and what media sources do you trust and why? And who and what media sources do you avoid? If we're not careful, our news feed will look like our Spotify feed. It's just putting us in an echo chamber around kind of hearing the same ideas. I have a practice of trying to listen to about 4 or 5 different news sources from a variety of different points of view, just so I can hear what stories are they telling and how are they telling the stories. Because by the way, it's about attention, but then how do they interpret? So we as human beings often like it when other people interpret reality for us, and that's often what the media does. We have to be very careful about how it's being interpreted, and it's important to hear multiple interpretations, and what stories are not being discussed. How do I surround myself with people who agree with my point of view, and do I surround myself with people who will challenge me? Really powerful attention inventory. The second one is to use something called the diversity wheel to identify your empathy bright spots and blind spots. So who easily evokes your empathy? Who are you missing? So you can look at this wheel, and in the center of the wheel is what we typically define as diversity, things like race or gender or ethnicity or age or sexual orientation. But also we can have bright spots and blind spots around the outside. Sometimes we may connect with people at work who have kids, so they're both parents. That's a good thing, but are we excluding anybody because we don't have those connections? And so who do I find difficult? And then who am I missing? Who can I get to know better? Where do I need to take off my shoes and try to walk into another's world? I love this quote from Abraham Lincoln. It's just so counterintuitive the way that many of us move through the world. I don't like that person. I should get to know them better. I love this idea that when you don't like someone, instead of avoiding, you get deeply curious. And then this next secret is, how do I then, once I've identified my blind spots, how do I build a visible empathy bridge, right? Who's one person that I avoid, ignore, overlook, or underestimate? And how might I get to know them better? And this is easier than you think, right? Invite them to a coffee, right? I do this actually in workshops with executives where we think about who's that person and how could you get to know them better? How could you create a moment where you could share each other's stories? And obviously you can do this in team settings, but one-on-one is a great place to start. And what happens is we change our signals to this other person because we consciously or non-consciously could have been sending the wrong signals. As we get curious and we want to understand them, this changes the signals. And then lastly is this idea of psychological safety. It's been a very popular idea. I think it was highlighted as the #1 characteristics of Google's high-performing teams. This comes from the work of Amy Edmondson. So in a psychologically safe environment, people believe that if they make a mistake, others will not penalize them or think less of them. And by the way, safety is just I can voice and not feel attacked, right? Doesn't mean you can't have debate, right? You can't have critical conversations. But it is that when I share something, I'm appreciated and respected. And what happens is, this is great for voicing concerns, but also voicing new ideas. Great article in the Harvard Business Review about how you can create it. I've got a couple of quick strategies. I add the blind spot to agendas. Like, what am I missing? What are we missing? Who have we forgotten? Always pass the mic early. Have everyone speak early in the meeting. When mistakes happen, be curious and forgiving. Seek to learn from them. And of course, role play conflict. Like, encourage each person on the team to sometimes play the person who's the challenger. And that way you kind of get passed around the different voices. So with that, I'm going to send it back to Vicky and see if there's got time for a couple of questions before we wrap up, and then I'd love to connect with you tomorrow. Vicky, you're on mute, I believe.
Thank you. Multitasking here does not work. Also, we were getting a question. I had typed about the next webinar is July 8th, and we'll put the link for that. I'll also be sending it around to everybody who was on the webinar today. So you'll get an email with that link to register. So we did have some other questions coming in. Let me pull up the Q&A. Jeff asked a question, please share your thoughts on the importance of empathetic leadership in a transformational organization, especially in high stress times, such as what we're facing today.
So transformation is really about growth, right? And we grow when we feel that it's safe to stretch beyond kind of where we are now. So I think part of it is beginning with safety. This is also about change. So if change is being experienced as I'm not in control, right? It's happening to me, then I often feel threatened and I get defensive. So what we want to think about is how do we increase, the word is agency, where the person feels like I am part of the change process of the transformation. And too often I've seen change really coming from the top and people are feeling dragged along with it as opposed to co-creating the change. That's a brief answer just so I can get to some other questions, but happy to dive deeper.
Yes, thank you. Jim asked a little bit earlier in the webinar, he shares from Rushworth Kidder, stated that an ethical decision must be honest, responsible, respectful, fair, and compassionate. All 5 of those. Would you see empathy overlapping to those?
So, by the way, I'll say this very quickly. Empathy can be part of an ethical decision. It doesn't have to be. Like, for example, you can come to an ethical decision and not understand someone else's point of view, right? Empathy is simply about understanding. I think empathy is really important when we try to act or voice our ethical concerns, because it's not just saying what we want to say from an ethical perspective, but how would we influence or how would we help someone else hear our particular ethical concern? So I don't think it overlaps so much as it can be an additional layer when we think about ethical action.
Thank you. Another question, this one from Cynthia, can you be too empathetic?
Yes, I highlighted this briefly in one of the slides. There is a danger with empathy in that it can be over-aroused. And what I mean by that is when we, in some sense, attend or stretch towards what someone else is experiencing, it can activate such emotional distress for us that we now have to take care of ourselves, right? And not be able to actually help someone else. And I'm sure many of us have felt that way in terms of what we're taking in on the news over the last several weeks and months. And so this thing called empathic distress can be a problem. By the way, the good thing about empathy is that it's a feeling function, but not only. So when you're having strong emotional response, this is actually where you want to move to cognitive empathy. So one can cool down the other, right? Sometimes you're looking at it too much at a distance, you're too zoomed out. So you actually need to activate the emotional concern. And I will say this, reading books, biographies, and watching films and documentaries is an incredible way to transport yourself into the experience of others that can be really powerful. And you can, in some sense, empathize, it's incomplete for sure, but it can really extend or expand your experience.
Professor Adkins, thank you.
Sure.
We had better stop with that question, but there are more questions and comments. So
Sure.
This will be yet another reminder that you are invited to join us tomorrow at 4. We'll do a Zoom call with Professor Adkins, and please feel free to arrive to that call and be ready to be on camera. It's not a requirement. You can leave your camera turned off if you want, but it's not webinar style. It's Zoom meeting style. And fairly informal. So we'll have a conversation around this subject for 60 minutes and learn from each other and learn more about Dr. Adkins' responses to our questions and thoughts, and also additional resources.
Fantastic.
Thank
Vicki,
you so much.
will they get information for the Zoom call tomorrow? I think someone had that, or they're already in there?
Yes. I'll go ahead and send an email that will include that information, so anyone who would like to join. Yeah.
Fantastic. Great. Yeah. Thank you so much. I hope you'll reach out with any follow-up questions. Hope to see you tomorrow. And, it's one of the exciting things about empathy is it makes you better at work and it makes you better at home with your loved ones and your community. So I appreciate your time today. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Chris. And Kalinda, also thank you for your assistance today. We sure appreciate it. Great. Hope to see you all tomorrow. Bye.
Bye.